This week, we're trying one of the few remaining A340s on a flight from Frankfurt to Hong Kong with Lufthansa. But more importantly, we'll be examining why, despite being one of Airbus's worst-selling planes, the A340 might not have been overall a failure. And well, in order to really justify that, we'll also dive into the history of Airbus. Yeah, this video probably got a bit out of hand.
Alright guys, on the plane. Not bad looking. Hopefully we'll get a better angle in Hong Kong. How do you get your dog into an airport? What? That thing didn't have like a support vest on it or anything. Just flew in here from London City Airport with Air Dolomiti. Weird airline, to be honest. They spoke Italian, German and English. But yeah, that's where we're up to. I got like an hour and a half until the flight leaves. Basically, not looking forward to this one tonight. Well, looking forward to going on an A340, but not looking forward to economy. I'm pretty sure there's someone sitting next to me. I brought my neck pillow. There's a limit to how many business class tickets I could afford in a year. I'm not even affording them. I'm doing it on points. I couldn't find a points ticket for this one. I think it's sausage time.
That's what she said.
Wow, Germany.
What? Squeeze the nipple? Get the sauce? Weird. I mean, it's hitting the spot right now, but for €8, probably not the best deal, but I guess it is. We're in an airport, so. Sorry, if it's not clear, I'm incredibly tired. You know what though? Let's get into a bit of history of Airbus, because we're flying an A340, which wasn't a super successful plane, but it played a pretty big role in the Airbus story, and it's an interesting case of a plane that didn't really work out for them, but that didn't really matter.
Today, there's pretty much a duopoly in the passenger aircraft market. It's Airbus versus Boeing. But how did we get here? Or more specifically, how did Airbus, the newer Euro conglomerate, end up as the world's largest passenger aircraft manufacturer? Well, it all goes back to the 60s. The global aerospace landscape back then was unequivocally American. They were riding a post-World War II boom, and Americans were taking to the skies. By 1960, American carriers moved over half of the world's air traffic when measured in passenger miles. And it wasn't just Americans flying. They also had a powerful aircraft production cycle domestically. Strong local demand led to large production runs for manufacturers like Boeing, Douglas, and Lockheed. These large production runs led to lower unit costs per aircraft, which in turn made them overwhelmingly more competitive on the global market. This in turn led to more revenue for the American manufacturers, which in turn allowed for more R&D and better technology. This all led to better planes, which led to more sales. The cycle continued, you get the point. The opposite was going on in Europe. Whilst the continent had pioneered many key aviation technologies, including the jet engine and the swept wing, the European aviation industry was a patchwork of national champions, each designing aircraft for their own state-owned airlines. None of these nation-states matched the scale of the US, and this led to a proliferation of different aircraft, each produced in small, economically unviable numbers. European aircraft production was stuck in this bad downward spiral. Consequently, European airlines, even the state-owned flag carriers, had little choice but to fill their fleets with American-made jets, and this created a significant and politically galling aerospace trade deficit. Europe was importing the very technology it had helped to pioneer. The core problem here was not a lack of engineering skill, but a crippling lack of scale. No single European company, nor even a single European nation, could muster the immense financial and industrial resources required to challenge the American giants head-on. It became clear that if Europe wanted to compete, it could not do so as a collection of independent states. It would have to act as one. The company that would become Airbus has its roots in an informal meeting that occurred at the 1965 Paris Air Show. Executives from Air France, Alitalia, British European Airways, Lufthansa, Sabena, and SAS came together to discuss their future fleet requirements. And they concluded that the American manufacturers were too focused on their own domestic needs and were not building the specific type of plane that they required. And this led to the concept of the Airbus, a plane that could carry between 225 and 300 people on journeys of around 1,200 nautical miles that would have an operating cost that was around 30% lower than the Boeing 727. The concept of the Airbus quickly worked its way back to the governments, and shortly after the meeting, officials from France, West Germany, and the UK began discussions around forming a consortium to build this plane. These discussions culminated in the signing of a Memorandum of Understanding in London on September 26, 1967. which committed the governments to jointly fund a development study into a new Airbus seating 300, or as it was shortened to, the A300. The initial partners involved were Sud Aviation, they would later become Aerospatiale from France. There was Hawker Siddeley from the UK, and then there was, I'm going to butcher this, Arbeitsgemeinschaft Airbus, or as it would later be known, Deutsche Airbus from West Germany. The initial split between the countries looked a bit like this. France and the UK were each allocated 37.5% of the shares, whilst West Germany took the remaining 25%. This split represented the industrial capabilities of each nation at the time. The initial engine R&D was split up, with Rolls-Royce in the UK to receive 75% of the development funds and the remaining 25% to be split equally between French and German engine manufacturers. With the UK leading the engine efforts, it was agreed between all parties that the French would then lead the airframe development effort. In 1969, with the design of the A300 well underway, everything was thrown into crisis when the UK decided to withdraw from the project. Their national carrier, BEA, lost interest in the plane, and Rolls-Royce had made the decision to instead focus on the development of the RB211 engine for the Lockheed L1011. I guess the UK just loves leaving European alliances. This could well have been a fatal blow to the project, but Hawker Siddeley, going against their own government, decided to push on with the project, investing their own capital and securing a loan from the West German government in order to continue their work on what would become the wings on the Airbus A300. With the UK withdrawal, the A300's design was pared back to a more modest 250-seat design. This allowed for the use of an existing engine design, the GE-CF6, which was being developed for the DC-10. This move significantly de-risked the whole project. The A300 entered service with Air France on May 23, 1974, and it was a technologically cutting-edge plane for two reasons. Firstly, the design. It was the first twin-engined wide-body jet. It offered passenger comfort and underfloor cargo capacity, all while having dramatically lower operating costs when compared to the American tri-engined jets of the era, the DC-10 and the L1011. Secondly, the manufacturing was just as innovative. Airbus established a complex logistics network using the Super Guppy planes that airlifted prefabricated components from all over Europe to the final assembly line in Toulouse. They really pioneered the just-in-time manufacturing system in the aerospace industry. Just because the plane was innovative, that didn't mean that it sold particularly well. The initial launch was overshadowed by the Concorde, and the first orders came almost exclusively from the home carriers, Air France and Lufthansa. Between 1975 and 1977, Airbus failed to sell a single aircraft. Salvation came in 1977 when they offered to lease 4 A300s to Eastern Airlines on a 6-month, no-cost trial. Eastern's CEO was astounded by the plane's performance, with it consuming 30% less fuel than Eastern's fleet of L1011s, and this led to Eastern placing an order for 23 A300s. And this single deal was a turning point in the whole program. It shattered the American manufacturer's monopoly over their own domestic market, and new orders started to flow. Now look, the A300 was by no means a huge commercial hit, but it kept Airbus alive, and it gave them the foundation for what was to come. But before we get into that, let's get back to Sleepy Simon and get on board the A340 first.
Lassen Sie Ihr Gepäck.
While we board here, I want to quickly touch on the corporate structure of Airbus. And I know this might sound a little bit boring, but trust me, it's quite interesting. How in the world does Airbus operate as this complex cross-governmental company? They have all these stakeholders, and generally when there's too many cooks in the kitchen, everything falls apart. But somehow Airbus has not only survived, but thrived. Let's go back to the beginning. Airbus Industrie was first formed in 1970 as a partnership between France's Aerospatiale and West Germany's Deutsche Airbus. But it soon expanded to include Spain's Construcciones Aeronauticas and the UK's British Aerospace. They all had a share of Airbus, but they were all still independent companies. The jointly held Airbus acted as the sales, marketing, and program management entity, but the actual engineering and manufacturing was still done by the independent companies.
That's a conflict of interest.
Each partner was incentivized to maximize the prices of their own sub-assemblies. Think British Aerospace still wanted to maximize their revenue from the wings they were supplying, and Aerospatiale wanted to maximize their revenue from the cockpits they were supplying. For 2 decades, this worked well enough. Airbus was able to become a major market force, but as the company grew, the project became more complex. The inherent inefficiencies became a significant competitive liability, especially against the fully integrated and streamlined Boeing. Oh, how this would all flip. The need for change here became dramatically apparent during the development of the A380. Costly production delays caused by German and French designers using incompatible versions of CAD software highlighted how the still fragmented Airbus needed change. It took a decade, but it did eventually happen. And I'll overly simplify this, but essentially the French, German, and Spanish entities all merged in 2000 to form the European Aeronautic Defence and Space Company, otherwise known as EADS. You might have seen this logo around. And then they would later go on to acquire the remaining British stake in 2006. This entity then owned the partnership that was Airbus, and then they went even further and merged it all in 2017, creating a fully integrated, lean, and commercially aligned corporation capable of taking on Boeing. This was, of course, all while Boeing was spinning out their many parts in order to improve shareholder value.
All right, on. It's okay. There's a metal bar in the back of my back right now. Not the most comfortable. The guy that's supposed to be sitting next to me, I think his wife is in the seat just there. And he's currently doing laps trying to find spare seats that they can go sit in. I don't think it's working. He's done like 2 laps of the whole cabin now. I'm praying for him.
Waiting on the stairs is also prohibited.
Unfortunately for both of us, the guy next to me couldn't find another seat on this flight. It was pretty full. So yeah, this is definitely one of the rougher flights that I've taken in the last few years. Either way, we took off at 9:55 p.m. and the crew pretty quickly brought around the dinner service. This was quite good. I was hungry. You know, a single sausage doesn't satisfy a man. Anyway, the meal service was fine. I got the Chinese chicken option. It wasn't incredible, but you know, satisfying enough for my hungry stomach. So let's get back to our Airbus and A340 story. We've got an early Airbus that's making a moderately successful A300, but where do you go from there? Well, the executives at Airbus knew from the beginning that they would need to offer a family of jets in order to become a major aircraft manufacturer. And so all the way back during the design phase of the A300, they had devised many different versions of the plane. They had the A300B1, the B2, the B3, all the way through to the B11. Some of these were stretched versions, some were freighter versions, but by 1975, a proposed shortened, longer-range version of the A300, it was designated the B10 model, had started to garner interest from airlines. And so they moved forward with what would become the A310. This ended up not just being a shorter A300, it introduced several key innovations, with the most significant being the 2-crew glass cockpit. Instead of the traditional array of analog dials, Airbus instead introduced 6 computer-driven CRT displays that centralized all of the flight, navigation, and systems information. This eliminated the need for a flight engineer, that person who sat behind the 2 pilots flying and just monitored all of the aircraft systems. The A310 entered service in April of 1983 with Swissair and was again a moderate success. It was the mid-80s at this point, and Airbus had established a foothold in the wide-body market, but they still recognized the importance of having a full family of jets, and so they turned their attention to the largest and most competitive segment of the aviation world, the narrow-body, single-aisle jet market. On March 2nd, 1984, they launched the A320 program. They didn't merely just enter the market, they revolutionized how aircraft are flown and redefined the whole competitive landscape. The A320 was designed to be a direct competitor to the Boeing 737, which had launched almost 2 decades earlier. Airbus knew that they couldn't just offer a comparable aircraft, they had to offer a superior one, and so they made the bold technological leap to use a fully digital fly-by-wire control system. This technology replaced the heavy and complex system of pulleys, cables, and rods used to physically move control surfaces with lightweight electronic interfaces. This created the famous Airbus joystick. It took pilots' inputs and then converted them into electronic signals that would then be sent to hydraulic actuators that would move the aircraft's control surfaces. But they didn't just take input signals and pass them straight off to the hydraulics. Airbus went one step further and they ran them all through a suite of flight control computers, and this allowed them to introduce a revolutionary safety feature known as flight envelope protection. These flight control computers are programmed with the aircraft's precise aerodynamic and structural limits. This meant that the system would not allow a pilot, even in a moment of panic or disorientation, to make a control input that would exceed these limits. For example, if a pilot tried to pitch the nose up so high that it would cause the plane to stall, the computers would simply say no.
Computer says no.
This digital safety net was a paradigm shift in aviation safety, but was a little bit controversial in the beginning. This demonstration flight, the one we're seeing right here, occurred within a couple of months of the A320 entering service in 1988 with Air France. There were 130 passengers on board, mostly media and special raffle ticket winners. Yeah. Remarkably, there were only 3 deaths that occurred here. I won't turn this into an episode of air crash investigation, but let's just say there was a multitude of factors that led to this accident. The official cause was a combination of poor flight planning and pilot error by Captain Michel Asseline. But Asseline denies any major wrongdoing. Instead, he attributes most of the blame onto the new fly-by-wire system and claims that Airbus, as well as the French government, performed a cover-up to protect their new cutting-edge plane. Again, I'll leave it here, but I highly recommend watching the episode of Air Crash Investigations on this particular incident if you have a conspiratorial bone in your body. I'll link it down below. Either way, fly-by-wire technology is pretty much standard on all planes today, and this didn't end up impacting Airbus's sales. Despite starting 2 decades after Boeing with the 737, the A320 today is the best-selling family of passenger jets globally. Now, why did I mention those planes in that amount of detail? Well, of course, they're fitting for our story of Airbus, but I also want to highlight how the first 3 Airbus models were all fairly technologically cutting edge, especially with the glass cockpits and fly-by-wire. Airbus was and still is a technologically cutting-edge plane builder, but they did take a step back with the A340. We'll get to that in a second, but first, let's cover the most unique thing about these Lufthansa A340s.
What a strange thing.
Good morning, I guess, from downstairs in the toilet. Look at that. Humongous countertop. The actual toilet area isn't huge, but weirdly massive countertop. I guess the ceilings are a little bit lower than usual.
Why are these down here? Well, it's mostly space saving, obviously. It allows Lufthansa to fit in more seats on the main deck, but just behind this mirror, they also have the crew rest area, bunks that allow the cabin crew to get some shut-eye. The A330 and the A340 fuselage is a bit antiquated in that it doesn't have space to fit overhead crew rest areas, like we see on more modern 777s, 787s, A350s, etc. There is a trade-off with cargo space here, but as we'll get to shortly, this specific A340 is a long boy, so this isn't really an issue.
I think this is every single economy class toilet is down here. There's no toilets at the back of the plane. Now, obviously, if you can't get downstairs, I'm pretty sure you can just use the business class toilets. I think that's how it works. It was interesting during the safety briefing, they specifically mentioned this area. You're only allowed 10 people down here because there's only 10 oxygen masks. There's some specific procedures just because you're, I guess, downstairs and away from things.
Guys, I might be drawing a bit of a long bow here, but downstairs toilets? Anybody thinking what I'm thinking? Spoons? My filming was all over the place, so we're just going to time travel to when the sun was up. They brought out breakfast just before landing into Hong Kong. It was, again, fine, standard economy stuff. Not great, but edible. The in-flight entertainment is very similar, just fine. Lufthansa doesn't have an incredible selection, but there was enough random TV shows to keep me entertained when I couldn't really sleep. But let's get back to the A340. By the mid-80s, as the A320 program was taking shape, Airbus turned their attention back to the wide-body market. It was time to develop a successor to the A300 and create a competitor to the Boeing 747 and 767. Their solution here was both unique and, depending on what lens you look at this through, brilliant. They decided to develop 2 distinct long-haul aircraft, the A340 and the A330. At the same time. This was a hugely ambitious project that could appear from the outside as quite risky, but let's run through some of the reasons why it made sense at the time. Firstly, Cost. This would make a lot of sense if they could pull it off. They planned to use the same airframe and wing design across both planes, and this would lead to cost savings of upwards of $500 million if they could pull it off. Secondly, Airbus at this point was still heavily entwined with governments, and according to Airbus's managing director at the time, John Pearson, it was a lot easier to sell a $3.5 billion combined program to the governments than it would have been to return to them 2 years later and ask for another $1.5 billion. And finally, ETOPS was still a major factor in aircraft operations back in the mid-80s. ETOPS, or Extended Range Twin Engine Operations Performance Standards, are a set of safety standards created by the International Civil Aviation Organization, and they dictate how far from an airport aircraft are allowed to fly in case of an engine failure. Back in the 80s, aircraft were only just being certified for ETOPS 120. This meant they could fly up to 120 minutes away from the nearest airport at single engine speed, and this limited the types of over-water routes that they could operate. This is why there was a whole era of tri-jets. Either way, by developing a quad jet and a twin jet at the same time, Airbus could hedge their bets as to the future of ETOPS. The A330, A340 program was also a move away from cutting-edge design, and instead a move to maximize market share and revenue. They'd already developed all of the new tech with the A310 and the A320. It was time to take advantage of that. Both the A330 and the A340 designs were not new ideas either. Their roots went all the way back to those alternative A300B designs. The A330 fit the concept of the B9, a stretched A300 with more powerful engines, and the A340 fit the B11, a shorter 4-engined A300. They went as far as to use the same cross-section of the A300 on the A330 and A340. Whilst it wasn't exactly the same fuselage, there was a whole bunch of learnings over 15 years in terms of material and design, but this still represented major cost savings. The whole program was comprised of 4 different variants. The A340-200 was the first to fly, entering service with Lufthansa on March 15th, 1993. 11 days later, the A340-300 started flying with Air France. Not even a year later, in January of 1994, the A330-300 entered service with Air Inter, and finally, the A330-200 started flying in April of 1998. Now, why did I mention all of these models? I never intend here to just read out Wikipedia tables to you. No, the reason I mention them is because they are all incredibly similar. They used the same fuselage designs, and in terms of length, the shorter 200 versions were within 60 centimeters of each other, and the longer 300 versions were identical. They also used the same wing, with the A340 just strapping on 2 extra engines. It's worth mentioning the engines here too. Firstly, the A330's 2 engines produced roughly the same total thrust as the 4 engines on the A340, but the A340's engines ended up handicapping the plane from the outset. Airbus had originally developed the A340 around a miracle new engine called the Turbofan. This was a high bypass geared turbofan being developed by IAE. What's so special about this engine? Well, it all comes down to that gearing. Let's do a quick jet engine explainer here. Turbofan jet engines have 2 main sections. There's a low pressure section at the front, and this is mostly the huge fan that you see, plus a low pressure compressor and a turbine. This section's job is to shove a mountain of cool air backwards at reasonable speeds. And then you've got a high pressure section inside, and this is the engine's core. This is the bit that burns the fuel and makes everything spin, but it also does shove air backwards. It's just doing it a lot quicker. And this leads us to bypass ratios. This is the ratio of the mass flow rate of air that bypasses that engine's core versus how much goes through it. Generally, bigger bypass ratios lead to better efficiency because you're able to move a lot of air a little faster versus a small amount of air really, really fast. The problem with classic turbofan engines is that the low pressure, slower spinning section at the front is directly coupled to the high pressure, fast spinning center core. These are rough numbers, but that big fan at the front wants to spin at something like 3000 RPM for maximum efficiency, whilst that center core is most efficient at around 10,000 RPM. This leads to compromises having to be made and in turn a non-optimally efficient engine design. By slapping a gearbox between those 2 sections, the engine would therefore be able to operate both sections at their optimal RPMs. But The problem here is that the gearbox is a ridiculously tough part to engineer. It has to withstand incredibly high temperatures and crazy torque loads, all while having to run reliably for years. And this is something that IAE was just not able to pull off, but they had sold Airbus on the idea. Airbus was marketing the plane with those proposed engines in the early days of development, but when IAE abandoned the project, Airbus was left scrambling, having to re-engineer existing conventional turbofans onto the A340, leading to 15 to 20% higher fuel burn versus the initially marketed figures. I do find it really interesting here. The A330 ended up being about 15 to 20% more efficient than the A340's final design. If IAE had pulled off this geared turbofan engine, then the A330 and the A340 could have been incredibly close in real-world performance. But that didn't happen, and the A340 ended up as a not super efficient plane. So how did Airbus differentiate what were incredibly similar planes? Well, there's obviously the big ETOPS point. Buy the quad jet if you need to fly over water. But range was also a big selling point here too. Now, if I ask you which could fly further, forgetting what you might actually know about these planes, you would probably say the A330s. Right? They burnt 15 to 20% less fuel per passenger kilometer. The fuselage and wing space for fuel was practically the same across both models. Surely the A330 would be the longer range jet, right? Well, no, it's always a bit more complicated. The A340s had a higher takeoff weight, but how? Well, this is an oddity of those extra engines and the wing. Bear with me. Wings produce lift. They bend upwards during flight. The fuselage doesn't produce lift. It's pulling the plane down, and this puts huge loads into that section where they connect the wings to the fuselage. Let's call it the hinge. Now, by adding those two extra heavy outboard engines, the wing naturally has more downward force, especially when they're placed far out from the fuselage like they are on the A340. This then reduces the amount of strain on that hinge that connects the wing to the fuselage during flight, and this in turn allows you to carry more weight. It's somewhat counterintuitive, but this allowed Airbus to certify the A340 with a higher maximum takeoff weight, allowing for more fuel, which allowed for more range. It has been revealed now by Airbus executive John Leahy that the A330's maximum takeoff weight was somewhat artificially limited to improve the marketability of the A340. This is fairly obvious as they have since slowly increased the maximum takeoff weight of the A330 over time. The A330 has been the dramatically better selling jet, with over 1,900 units sold since launch, whilst the A340 has only sold 377 units over its lifetime. Rather strangely, Airbus did introduce new variants of the A340 in the late 90s, despite its poor sales. We'll get into that shortly, but first, let's go and land into Hong Kong.
Wow. Okay, that one was basically no fun, but still a cool plane nonetheless.
The plane I flew on for this flight was a Lufthansa A340-600, one of the two new variants of the A340 that Airbus introduced in the late 90s. But why introduce updated versions of a plane that wasn't selling particularly well? It comes down to what airlines wanted at the time. They were looking for a 350 to 400 seat replacement for the 747-400 and a jet capable of ultra long distance flying. ETOPS restrictions had been easing, 180-minute operations had been granted in 1988, but 240 plus minute certification was still not a sure thing, leading to some airlines and their regulators still preferring 4-engined jets. It was also a bit of a competitive play. Boeing had introduced the 777 at this point and was starting to market what would become the 777-300ER to airlines as a replacement for the 747. Airbus wanted to be able to steal some of those sales and not leave the door too wide open for Boeing here. They had been quietly developing the A380 in the 90s, but this was still years off and, well, was a much larger scale aircraft. They already had all the tooling and production lines going for the A340, so why not create new versions to fill these boxes? They introduced the A340-500 and the A340-600 in December of 1997. Both were lengthened versions of the original A340s, with the 500 variant being the ultra long haul option, and the 600 being the super long 380-seater plane that could replace 747-400s for airlines. These upsized A340s used a new, larger wing design and more powerful Rolls-Royce engines that helped redeem its early reputation as being an underpowered jet. But the general flow for airlines at the time was still towards big twin jets. They were just more efficient, and ETOPS was becoming less of an issue every decade. To the point that today's longest flights are all done by twin jet, mostly A350s. Airbus still tops the table when it comes to ultra long haul flying. I think if we just zoom out here, the overarching story of the A340, whilst being barely a break-even jet, was not overall a failure for Airbus. If we look at the whole program, it's more like Airbus made the A330-40, a plane that could be optioned with 2 or 4 engines, depending on what was required. And in this case, the A330 was clearly the winner. But in reality, the whole program was still a massive success, and it helped to grow Airbus into the massive manufacturer that they are today. Here's just a few extra fun nerdy facts at the end here that didn't quite fit into the main story. The designators A330 and A340 were originally reversed, following with Airbus tradition on sequential naming, and with the quad jet being the first to enter service, it was originally going to be called the A330. But the sales team at Airbus interjected here, explaining that airlines would never wrap their heads around a twin jet having a 4 in its name and not the quad.
You can't sell these.
Also, geared turbofans on medium to large jet engines only started flying in 2016 with the Pratt & Whitney 1000G. It is a significantly more efficient engine, but has been plagued with technical issues. Not exactly related to that gearbox, more with seals and corrosion. Either way, they're out there, but they're not a huge commercial success yet. And finally, this one's just a bit random, and my only source is this one book. I read the whole thing in a night. It was a great source for this video. But the winglets that you see on all of the A330s and, well, A340s, they were all made in Australia by Hawker de Havilland. I just thought that was an interesting little tidbit, and I'll look at them differently whenever I'm on an A330 going forward. Anyway, I hope you all enjoyed that video. I hope you learned something. Make sure you go and follow me on Instagram here. Also, go and follow me on LinkedIn here. I am semi-ironically trying to become a LinkedIn influencer. Go check out flightformula.com. I'll see you all in the next one. Bye.
Simon? Is that Simon?
What's Simon?